The grand throne room of Windsor Castle buzzed with the usual morning activities as servants prepared for the day's royal ceremonies. Sunlight streamed through the massive stained-glass windows, casting colorful patterns across the polished marble floors. The royal guards stood at their posts like living statues, their red uniforms immaculate and their expressions stoic. Among them was Thomas Mitchell, a 28-year-old guard who had served the crown for 7 years with unwavering dedication. Thomas had always taken pride in his ability to remain motionless for hours, never breaking character no matter what happened around him. He had endured tourists taking photos inches from his face, children trying to make him laugh, and even birds landing on his tall black hat. Nothing had ever made him flinch or speak while on duty. His fellow guards often joked that he was made of stone, but Thomas preferred to think of it as professional excellence. On this particular Tuesday morning, the castle was preparing for a special visit from several diplomatic families. The Queen had personally requested that everything be perfect, as these guests included important allies from various Commonwealth nations. The children of these diplomats would be touring the castle, and everyone knew that young visitors could be unpredictable. The head of security had briefed all guards to maintain their composure regardless of what the children might do or say. As Thomas took his position near the ornate golden throne, he noticed the excited chatter of voices echoing from the corridor. The first group of visitors was arriving earlier than expected. Among them was the Sharma family from India, whose father served as a cultural ambassador. Mrs. Sharma held the hand of their 3-year-old daughter, Priya, whose dark eyes sparkled with curiosity as she took in the magnificent surroundings. Priya had never seen anything like the grandeur of Windsor Castle. The high ceiling seemed to stretch endlessly above her, and everything around her gleamed with gold and precious stones. But what caught her attention most were the guards in their bright red uniforms and tall black hats. She had seen soldiers in movies, but these men looked like they belonged in a fairy tale. Her small fingers pointed excitedly at each guard as her mother tried to keep her close to the group. The tour guide, an elderly gentleman named Mr. Pemberton, began explaining the history of the throne room to the gathered families. His voice carried the weight of decades spent sharing these stories, and most of the adults listened intently. However, Priya found herself drawn away from the group, her tiny feet carrying her toward the impressive figure of Thomas Mitchell. Something about this particular guard seemed different to her young mind, though she couldn't quite understand what it was. As she approached Thomas, Priya studied his face with the intense concentration that only small children possess. His jaw was set firmly, his eyes stared straight ahead, and not a single muscle in his face moved. To most observers, he appeared exactly like every other royal guard performing their duty. But Priya saw something that the adults missed, something that would soon change everything in that ancient throne room. The other families continued their tour, moving slowly around the room as Mr. Pemberton pointed out various artifacts and paintings. Mrs. Sharma called softly for Priya to return to the group, but the little girl remained transfixed by the guard before her. She tilted her head to one side, then the other, as if trying to solve a puzzle that only she could see. Thomas was aware of the child's presence but maintained his professional stance. He had dealt with curious children countless times before, and he knew that eventually a parent would come to collect her. He focused on his breathing and kept his gaze fixed on the far wall, just as he had been trained to do. Nothing about this situation seemed unusual or challenging, but Priya continued to stare, and something in her expression began to shift. Her initial wonder gave way to a look of recognition, as if she had suddenly understood something important. She took a small step closer to Thomas, close enough that he could hear her soft breathing. The room around them seemed to fade away as the moment stretched between the motionless guard and the observant child. What happened next would become one of the most talked-about incidents in recent royal history, though at that moment, no one in the throne room could have predicted the extraordinary turn of events that was about to unfold. Priya's small voice cut through the hushed atmosphere of the throne room like a bell. Her tiny finger pointed directly at Thomas Mitchell as she spoke 2 simple words that would echo through the halls of Windsor. "Castle for years to come, Daddy crying." The words were spoken with the matter-of-fact clarity that only a 3-year-old could manage, but their impact was immediate and profound. Thomas felt his carefully maintained composure crack for the first time in his 7-year career. His eyes, which had remained fixed on the distant wall, involuntarily shifted down to meet the gaze of the small girl before him, Mrs. Sharma, who had been approaching to collect her daughter. stopped mid-step. Mr. Pemberton's well-practiced tour commentary faltered as the other families turned to see what was happening. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence as everyone tried to process what the child had said. To most of the adults, Thomas appeared exactly as he should, stoic, professional, and completely composed. But Priya saw what others could not. Despite his rigid training and years of practice, Thomas Mitchell was indeed fighting back tears. The previous evening, he had received devastating news that his younger brother David had been killed in a motorcycle accident. David was only 24 years old, full of life and dreams that would never be fulfilled. Thomas had spent the entire night at the hospital, holding his brother's hand one last time before having to report for duty the next morning. Royal Guards were expected to maintain their posts regardless of personal circumstances, and Thomas had never considered asking for time off. His sense of duty ran too deep, and he believed that serving the crown meant putting personal feelings aside completely. He had convinced himself that he could push through the grief, that his training would carry him through this shift as it had carried him through so many others. However, the innocent observation of a 3-year-old had shattered the wall he had built around his emotions. Priya's words weren't spoken with malice or even awareness of their significance. She had simply seen something that touched her young heart, and expressed it with the honesty that adults often lose as they grow older. In her world, when someone was sad, you acknowledged it and tried to help. The other guards in the room began to take notice of the unusual situation. They could see that something had shifted in Thomas's demeanor, though they couldn't understand what a small child could have possibly said to affect their seemingly unshakable colleague. Sergeant Williams, who supervised the throne room detail, moved closer to assess whether intervention was necessary. Thomas struggled to regain his composure, but Priya's words had opened a floodgate of emotions that he had been suppressing since receiving the terrible news. His brother's face flashed before his eyes. David's infectious laugh, his terrible jokes, his dreams of becoming a teacher. They had planned to spend the upcoming weekend together, something they had been doing less frequently as their adult lives became more complicated. The diplomatic families watched in fascination and growing concern as the scene unfolded before them. Some of the adults began to whisper among themselves, wondering if they were witnessing some sort of breach of royal protocol. Others seemed moved by the obvious humanity of the moment, recognizing that even those who serve in the most formal capacities are still people with hearts that can be broken. Priya remained standing before Thomas, her expression now showing concern rather than curiosity. She had seen adults cry before, and her instinct was always to offer comfort. Without hesitation, she reached up with her small hand and gently touched Thomas's white glove. The gesture was simple but profound, a bridge between her innocent world and his world of duty and grief. Mrs. Sharma finally approached her daughter, unsure whether to apologize for the disruption or simply remove Priya from the situation. But something in the scene before her made her pause. She recognized the look in the guard's eyes, the same expression her own father had worn when he tried to hide his sadness after her grandmother's death. It was the look of someone carrying a burden too heavy for one person to bear alone. The throne room that had seemed so grand and imposing moments before now felt intimate and human. The formal barriers between guard and visitor, between duty and emotion, had been softened by the honest words of a child who saw the world without the filters that adults learn to apply. What happened next would test the boundaries of royal protocol and reveal the true character of everyone present in that historic room. The silence in the throne room stretched like a held breath as everyone processed the unprecedented moment unfolding before them. Thomas Mitchell stood frozen, his years of training warring with the raw grief that Priya's innocent words had unleashed. A single tear had escaped despite his best efforts, rolling down his cheek and catching the morning sunlight that streamed through the stained glass windows. Sergeant Williams approached carefully, his mind racing through protocols that had never covered a situation quite like this one. He had served alongside Thomas for 3 years and had never seen the younger guard show even the slightest crack in his professional demeanor. The sergeant's first instinct was to quietly remove Thomas from his post, but something about the scene before him made him hesitate. Priya looked up at her mother with the wisdom that sometimes emerges from the mouths of children. "Mama, the pretty soldier is sad like Uncle Raj was when Grandmama went to heaven," she whispered, her voice carrying clearly in the hushed room. Mrs. Sharma felt her heart clench as she recognized the profound empathy her daughter was displaying. even as she worried about the appropriateness of the situation. The other diplomatic families had stopped their tour entirely, drawn into the human drama playing out before the Golden Throne. Ambassador Chen from Singapore found himself thinking of his own son, who served in their National Guard. Mrs. O'Brien from Ireland remembered her brother who had died in service, and how difficult it had been for her family to maintain their composure during public duties. The formal atmosphere of the royal tour had transformed into something much more personal and meaningful. Thomas struggled with conflicting impulses. Every fiber of his training told him to maintain his post and his composure, to not allow personal matters to interfere with his duty to the crown. But Priya's simple observation had stripped away his defenses, leaving him vulnerable in a way he had never experienced while in uniform. The weight of his grief felt suddenly unbearable, made heavier by his attempt to carry it alone. Mr. Pemberton, who had been conducting royal tours for over 2 decades, had never encountered anything quite like this situation. He had seen guards deal with difficult visitors, unruly children, and even medical emergencies, but he had never witnessed such a profound human moment in the formal setting of the throne room. His usual script seemed inadequate for the circumstances. The young girl continued to study Thomas's face with the intense focus that children bring to things that capture their attention. She seemed to understand that something important was happening, even if she couldn't fully grasp the complexity of the adult world around her. Her small hand remained gently placed on Thomas's glove, a gesture of comfort that transcended the formal boundaries of the royal setting. Other guards in the room began to shift slightly, breaking their rigid poses as they tried to understand what was happening to their colleague. They had all been trained to ignore distractions and maintain their posts regardless of circumstances. But this situation felt different from anything they had encountered in their service. The humanity of the moment was impossible to ignore. Mrs. Sharma knelt down beside her daughter, speaking softly in Hindi before switching to English. "Priya, sweetheart, sometimes grown-ups have sad feelings, but they have to do their work anyway," she explained gently. But even as she spoke the words, she wondered if they were true. Should anyone have to hide their grief so completely, even while serving in such an important role? Thomas finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Thank you, little one," he managed to say, his words directed at Priya but heard by everyone in the immediate vicinity. It was the first time in his career that he had spoken while on duty in the throne room, breaking one of the most fundamental rules of his position. The breach of protocol sent a ripple of shock through the observing guards and staff members. Sergeant Williams knew that he needed to take action, but he also recognized that this was no ordinary situation. The human drama unfolding before him challenged everything he thought he knew about duty, service, and the balance between personal and professional responsibilities. Ambassador Chen stepped forward, his diplomatic instincts guiding him toward what felt like an important moment in human relations. "Perhaps," he said quietly to Sergeant Williams, "there are times when our humanity must come before our protocols." His words carried the weight of years spent navigating complex international situations, but this felt more personal than any negotiation he had ever conducted. The stage was set for a decision that would either uphold the rigid traditions of royal service or acknowledge that even those who serve the crown are human, beings with hearts that can break. The next few moments would determine not just Thomas Mitchell's fate, but also set a precedent for how the royal household would handle such situations in the future. Sergeant Williams found himself at a crossroads that no military manual had prepared him for. As he looked at Thomas Mitchell, he saw not just a guard who had broken protocol, but a young man carrying an unbearable burden. The sergeant's own experience told him that grief suppressed too deeply could destroy a person from the inside, and he began to question whether their rigid adherence to tradition was always the right path. Before anyone could speak further, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the throne room. The unmistakable clip of expensive shoes on marble announced the arrival of someone important. The entire group turned to see Lady Catherine Worthington, the Queen's private secretary, entering the room with her usual brisk efficiency. She had come to check on the diplomatic tour and ensure everything was proceeding smoothly. Lady Catherine had served the royal household for 15 years and prided herself on maintaining the highest standards of protocol. Her sharp eyes immediately took in the unusual scene before her, a guard who appeared to be emotional, a small child touching his glove, and a group of diplomatic visitors standing in uncomfortable silence. Her expression remained neutral, but those who knew her well could see the wheels turning behind her calculating gaze. "Good morning, everyone," Lady Catherine said with practiced diplomacy, her voice carrying just enough authority to remind everyone of where they were. "I trust the tour is proceeding well?" Her question was directed at Mr. Pemberton, but her eyes remained fixed on the situation with Thomas and Priya. Mrs. Sharma felt compelled to speak up, her maternal instincts overriding diplomatic protocol. "My daughter noticed that the guard seemed upset," she explained carefully, not wanting to cause trouble for anyone but feeling that honesty was important. "Children sometimes see things that adults miss." Her words carried both an apology and a gentle defense of her daughter's innocent observation. Lady Catherine's expression softened almost imperceptibly as she looked at Priya, who was still maintaining her protective stance near Thomas. The private secretary had seen many children during royal events, but there was something about this little girl's earnest concern that touched even her well-guarded heart. She had children of her own and understood their capacity for both disruption and profound insight. Thomas straightened his shoulders, expecting to be immediately relieved of his duties and possibly face disciplinary action. He had violated fundamental rules of royal service, and there would be consequences. But as he prepared to accept his fate, he felt Priya's small hand squeeze his glove gently, as if she were trying to give him strength for whatever was about to happen. "Sergeant Williams," Lady Catherine said quietly, "perhaps you could escort Guard Mitchell to the anteroom for a brief discussion." Her tone was professional but not harsh, and those familiar with royal protocol recognized this as a more merciful approach than might have been expected. She was offering Thomas a way to leave the public space with some dignity and tact. But before anyone could move, Priya spoke up again with the fearless honesty of childhood. "Are you going to be mean to the sad soldier?" she asked Lady Catherine directly, her small chin lifted defiantly. "He's crying because someone he loves went away forever. Mama told me that's the saddest thing that can happen." The room fell silent again as everyone absorbed the child's words. Lady Catherine found herself in uncharted territory. She had handled diplomatic crises, media scandals, and countless breaches of protocol, but she had never been challenged so directly by a 3-year-old who was clearly prepared to defend someone she perceived as needing protection. The private secretary realized that how she handled this moment would be remembered by everyone present, and possibly become part of royal lore. Ambassador Chen stepped forward again, his diplomatic training guiding him toward what felt like a crucial moment. "If I may," he said respectfully, "in my culture we believe that showing grief for those we've lost honors their memory. Perhaps this young lady has reminded us all of something important about our shared humanity." The other diplomatic families nodded in agreement, creating an unexpected alliance in support of both Thomas and Priya. Mrs. O'Brien from Ireland added quietly, "In times of loss, we all need to be reminded that we're not alone. This child has shown remarkable compassion." The formal diplomatic tour had transformed into something far more meaningful than anyone had anticipated. Thomas looked around the room, seeing faces filled with sympathy rather than judgment. For the first time since receiving the devastating news about his brother, he didn't feel completely alone with his grief. The unexpected kindness from strangers, sparked by a child's innocent observation, began to heal something inside him that he hadn't even realized was broken. Lady Catherine realized that this moment had grown far beyond a simple breach of protocol. The eyes of international diplomats were upon her, along with their children who would remember how the royal household chose to handle human vulnerability. Her next decision would reflect not just on palace policy, but on the character of the institution she served. The weight of that responsibility settled on her shoulders as she prepared to respond to the most unusual situation of her distinguished career. Lady Catherine looked down at Priya's determined face and felt something shift inside her carefully maintained professional demeanor. The child's unwavering defense of Thomas had created a moment that transcended protocol and touched the heart of what service truly meant. After a long pause that seemed to stretch through the ornate throne room, the Queen's private secretary made a decision that would become legendary in royal circles. "No, my dear," Lady Catherine said gently to Priya, kneeling down to the child's eye level. "We're not going to be mean to anyone today. In fact, I think your soldier friend could use some kindness right now." Her words carried through the room, creating a collective exhale of relief from the diplomatic families who had been holding their breath. Thomas couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had expected immediate dismissal, possibly even criminal charges for abandoning his post. Instead, he found himself surrounded by unexpected allies led by a 3-year-old girl who had somehow seen through his professional mask to the grieving brother beneath. The moment felt surreal, like something from a dream rather than the rigid reality of royal service. Lady Catherine stood and addressed the room with the same authority she used when speaking for the Queen herself. "Ladies and gentlemen, I believe we have witnessed something quite extraordinary today. This young lady has reminded us all that our service to the crown should never require us to abandon our humanity." Her words carried weight that everyone present understood this was not just her personal opinion, but a reflection of royal values. Mrs. Sharma felt tears gathering in her own eyes as she watched her daughter's natural compassion create ripples of change in one of the most formal institutions in the world. She had worried about Priya's bold behavior, but now she felt nothing but pride in her child's instinctive kindness. The other parents in the group nodded their agreement, recognizing that their children were witnessing a lesson in empathy that no classroom could provide. Sergeant Williams stepped forward, his years of military experience guiding him toward practical solutions. "Ma'am, if I may suggest, perhaps Guard Mitchell could be granted emergency leave to attend to his family matters." His proposal offered a way forward that honored both the unusual circumstances and the needs of a grieving soldier. "An excellent suggestion, Sergeant," Lady Catherine replied, her tone indicating that this was not a request but a decision. "Guard Mitchell, you are hereby granted immediate compassionate leave. Please take the time you need to be with your family during this difficult period." Thomas felt his knees weaken with relief and gratitude, emotions he had been suppressing for over 12 hours. Priya clapped her small hands together, delighted that her intervention had helped the sad soldier. She didn't fully understand the complexities of what had just happened, but she knew that the grown-ups had chosen kindness over strictness, and that made her happy. Her innocent joy brought smiles to faces throughout the room, lightening the emotional weight of the moment. Ambassador Chen approached Lady Catherine with deep respect. "Madam, what we have witnessed today speaks volumes about the character of the British royal household. My family will remember this demonstration of compassion for years to come." His words echoed the sentiments of all the diplomatic visitors, who had expected a formal tour but instead received an unforgettable lesson in human dignity. Thomas removed his ceremonial hat and turned to face Priya directly. "Thank you, little angel," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You helped me when I didn't even know I needed help." He knelt down to her level, and she spontaneously wrapped her small arms around his neck in a hug that dissolved the last of his carefully maintained composure. The other guards in the room, who had watched the entire scene unfold with growing amazement, began to see their colleague in a new light. They had all experienced loss and grief during their service, but none had ever imagined that showing vulnerability could be met with understanding rather than punishment. The precedent being set would influence how they supported each other in the future. Lady Catherine made a mental note to brief the Queen personally about the morning's events. She knew that Her Majesty would be interested in how a child's compassion had revealed both the humanity of their guards and the need for flexibility within royal protocol. This incident would likely lead to policy discussions about supporting staff during personal crises. Mr. Pemberton, who had been struggling to find words adequate for the situation, finally spoke up. "In all my years of conducting tours, I have never witnessed such a beautiful display of human kindness," he said, his voice carrying the emotion that everyone in the room was feeling. "This little lady has taught us all something important about seeing each other clearly." As the formal atmosphere of the throne room gave way to something warmer and more human, everyone present realized they had been part of something special. The rigid boundaries between guard and visitor, between duty and emotion, had been softened by a child's honest observation and the decision by those in authority to choose compassion over convention. What had begun as a routine diplomatic tour had become a story that would be told and retold throughout the halls of power. As Thomas prepared to leave his post for the first time in 7 years under such extraordinary circumstances, the weight of the moment settled on everyone in the throne room. Lady Catherine personally escorted him toward the exit, a gesture that spoke volumes about the unprecedented nature of the situation. The other guards watched with a mixture of amazement and gratitude, knowing that their own service had been forever changed by what they had witnessed. Priya skipped alongside Thomas and Lady Catherine, chattering happily about how glad she was that the pretty soldier wasn't sad anymore. Her innocent joy provided a counterpoint to the heavy emotions that had filled the room just moments before. Mrs. Sharma followed her daughter, marveling at how a simple diplomatic tour had become a life-changing experience for everyone involved. Word of the extraordinary. Events in the throne room began to spread through Windsor Castle's staff with the speed that only truly remarkable news can travel. Kitchen workers paused in their duties to listen as security guards shared the story. Housekeeping staff stopped their cleaning to hear about the little girl who had seen what the adults had missed. By afternoon, the tale had reached every corner of the castle. The Queen herself was informed of the morning's events during her daily briefing with Lady Catherine. Her Majesty listened with growing interest as her private secretary described how a 3-year-old had essentially rewritten royal protocol through pure compassion. The Queen's response surprised even her most trusted advisor. Perhaps it's time we remembered that our service is strongest when it acknowledges our humanity, rather than hiding it. Meanwhile, Thomas made his way home to his grieving family, carrying with him not just official leave papers but also something far more valuable: the knowledge that his pain had been seen and acknowledged by strangers who chose kindness over convenience. The weight of his grief hadn't disappeared, but he no longer carried it alone. Priya's simple words had created a support network he never knew he needed. The diplomatic families completed their tour with Mr. Pemberton, but their conversations were dominated by what they had witnessed in the throne room. Ambassador Chen's children peppered him with questions about why the soldier had been crying and whether they would have been as brave as Priya. Mrs. O'Brien's teenage son, who had initially been bored by the formal tour, found himself deeply moved by the display of human compassion he had witnessed. Back in the throne room, the remaining guards found themselves serving with a different understanding of their role. The rigid expectations remained, but there was now an acknowledgement that they were human beings first and ceremonial figures second. Sergeant Williams made a note to recommend policy changes that would provide better support for guards, dealing with personal tragedies while maintaining the dignity of their service. Lady Catherine spent the afternoon fielding calls from other royal households around the world who had heard whispers of the morning's events. The story was spreading through diplomatic channels, with each telling emphasizing the wisdom shown by the royal staff in choosing compassion over rigid protocol. Several foreign dignitaries requested copies of the new guidelines that would surely emerge from this incident. The media remained unaware of what had transpired, as royal protocol dictated that internal matters stayed internal. However, the diplomatic families carried the story back to their home countries, where it became part of official reports about British royal character and values. The tale of the observant little girl and the grieving guard would influence international relations in ways that no one could have predicted. Priya's parents spent the evening discussing with their daughter what had happened at the castle. They used simple words to explain concepts like grief, compassion, and standing up for others who are hurting. Priya listened with the serious attention she gave to all important matters, occasionally asking if the soldier would be okay and whether she could visit him again someday. Thomas spent his first evening of compassionate leave with his family, sharing stories about David and beginning the difficult process of planning a funeral. But now he had something to sustain him through the darkest moments: the memory of a small girl who had seen his pain and refused to let him suffer alone. Her courage had created a moment of grace that would carry him through the difficult days ahead. The throne room settled into its usual evening quiet, but the space had been forever changed by what had occurred within its walls. The golden throne remained in its place. The stained glass windows continued to cast their colorful patterns, but the rigid barriers between duty and humanity had been permanently softened by 2 simple words from a child who saw the world with unclouded eyes. As night fell over Windsor Castle, the staff members who had witnessed or heard about the day's events went to sleep with a new understanding of what true service could look like. They had learned that sometimes the most profound acts of loyalty to the crown involved remembering that those who serve are worthy of compassion and support, especially in their darkest hours. 3 months later, Windsor Castle hosted another diplomatic gathering, but this time the atmosphere carried a subtle difference that those familiar with the previous incident could immediately sense. The guards maintained their professional bearing, but there was a warmth in their eyes that hadn't been there before. New protocols had been quietly implemented, ensuring that staff members facing personal crises would receive appropriate support without compromising their dignity or service record. Thomas Mitchell had returned to active duty after attending his brother's funeral and taking time to grieve properly with his family. His fellow guards had rallied around him during his absence, and he returned to find a support network that extended far beyond his immediate unit. The brotherhood among the guards had deepened, with regular check-ins becoming standard practice rather than the exception. Lady Catherine had presented the Queen with a comprehensive report about the incident and its aftermath, leading to several policy changes throughout the royal household. Staff members were now encouraged to seek support during difficult times, and supervisors received training on recognizing signs of grief and trauma. The changes were implemented quietly without fanfare, but their impact was felt throughout the organization. The story of Priya's intervention had become part of castle lore, shared in whispered conversations among staff members who wanted to remember the day when a child's compassion changed everything. New guards were told the tale during their orientation, not as entertainment but as an example of the humanity that should never be completely hidden beneath their formal duties. Mrs. Sharma had maintained correspondence with Lady Catherine, sharing updates about Priya's continued development and her ongoing questions about the soldier friend she had helped. The little girl had become something of a celebrity in her social circle, with other parents using her story to teach their children about empathy and courage. Priya herself remained largely unaware of her fame, focused instead on her daily adventures and discoveries. The diplomatic families who had witnessed the throne room incident carried the story back to their home countries, where it became part of official cultural exchanges. Several nations implemented similar policies supporting their own ceremonial guards and staff members. The ripple effects of one child's observation continued to spread across international boundaries, influencing how formal institutions approached the balance between tradition and humanity. Thomas often found himself thinking about that, mourning and how drastically his life had changed because a 3-year-old had seen what others missed. He had framed a photo of himself with Priya from that day, and it sat on his desk at home as a reminder that vulnerability could be a source of strength rather than weakness. His service to the crown had become more meaningful because it no longer required him to completely suppress his humanity. The Queen herself had requested a private meeting with Lady Catherine to discuss the broader implications of the incident. Her Majesty expressed particular interest in how the royal household could better support its staff, while maintaining the dignity and tradition that defined their service. The conversation led to the establishment of a discreet counseling program and emergency support, protocols that would prevent future incidents from reaching such a crisis. Mr. Pemberton continued to conduct his tours, but he always lingered a bit longer in the throne room, sharing an abbreviated version of the story with visitors who seemed particularly interested in the human side of royal service. He had developed a talent for reading his audiences and knowing when to share the tale of how compassion had triumphed over protocol in that very room. Ambassador Chen had included the incident in his official report to his government, praising the British royal household's handling of the situation. His recommendation led to cultural exchange programs that specifically focused on how different nations balance tradition with human dignity in their formal institutions. The story became a case study in diplomatic circles about the power of individual compassion to influence institutional change. On quiet days in the throne room, Thomas sometimes caught himself looking toward the spot where Priya had stood when she made her life-changing observation. He would remember her small hand on his glove and her fearless defense of a stranger's right to grieve. Those memories sustained him through difficult moments and reminded him that his service was part of something larger than protocol and tradition. The legacy of that extraordinary morning continued to influence daily life at Windsor Castle in countless small ways. Staff members checked on each other more regularly. Supervisors looked beyond surface appearances to see the whole person, and everyone remembered that sometimes the most profound wisdom comes from the most unexpected sources. A 3-year-old girl had taught an entire institution that true strength lay not in hiding human emotions but in acknowledging them with dignity and compassion. Years would pass, but the story of Priya and Thomas would remain a cherished part of Windsor Castle's history. It served as a reminder that even in the most formal settings, there was always room for kindness, understanding, and the simple recognition that behind every uniform stood a human being deserving of compassion. The throne room continued to host important ceremonies and diplomatic events, but it would forever be remembered as the place where a child's honesty changed everything.